The LinkedIn notification came from a mutual connection, someone we had both gone to high school with, a woman named Tasha who stayed connected with everyone and who forwarded things without always understanding why they might matter. The message said, "Hey Zoe, saw your sister is at Harmon Group now, congrats to her." I clicked the profile. My sister Jade's name at the top, her photograph, her current position at Harmon Group, a mid-size consulting firm in Atlanta that I recognized because I had applied there 2 years earlier and had been waitlisted and had never heard back. I scrolled down. Education, University of Georgia, Bachelor of Science Business Administration, GPA 3.9, Dean's List 3 consecutive years, graduated with honors. I stopped scrolling. I had a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from the University of Georgia, GPA 3.9, Dean's List 3 consecutive years, graduated with honors. Jade had attended University of Georgia for 2 years and had transferred to a community college and had graduated with an associate's degree in administrative management. I kept scrolling. Under certifications, a project management certification from a program I recognized because I had completed it. The same program, the same certification number format. Under recommendations, 2 names I recognized immediately, Dr. Patricia Moore and Professor James Holloway. My academic advisor and the professor who had written my strongest recommendation letter for graduate school applications. They had written those letters for me. Not for Jade. I sat very still for a long time. Then I called my mother. Not Jade, my mother first, because I needed to understand what I was looking at before I did anything with it. My mother answered on the second ring. I said, "Mom, has Jade ever mentioned using my academic records for anything?" Silence. The specific silence of someone who knows something and is deciding how much of it to give. My mother said, "Zoe, sweetheart." I said, "Mom, tell me." "My name is Zoe Williams. I am 29 years old. I graduated from the University of Georgia 4 years ago with a 3.9 GPA, Dean's List honors, and a degree I had worked for across 4 years of early mornings and late nights, and the specific discipline of someone who understood that the degree was the door and that everything behind the door depended on what she did to earn it. I am the younger of 2 sisters. Jade is 32. We grew up in Atlanta in a close family, the kind where Sunday dinners are non-negotiable and where your sister's problems become your problems in the specific way that proximity and love produce. Jade had always struggled with school in the way that some people struggle, not for lack of intelligence, but for lack of the specific tolerance for institutional constraint that academic environments require. She had transferred twice, graduated later than planned, and spent her mid-20s building a career in administrative work that did not require the credentials she had not accumulated. 2 years ago, she had asked to borrow my diploma. I want to be precise about the ask because the precision matters. She had not asked to copy it or to use it. She had asked to borrow it for 2 days because she was, she said, researching continuing education programs and wanted to see what her options were and how her existing credentials compared to mine. 2 days. Comparison purposes. I had said yes because she was my sister. I had not seen the diploma since. My mother's name is Gloria. She is 58 years old, and she has spent 30 years managing the specific diplomacy required to love 2 daughters who are very different from each other without either of them feeling that difference as a judgment. She had not always succeeded. I had felt, for years, the particular weight of being the daughter who achieved things in the ways that were visible and measurable, and that could be pointed to at Sunday dinners. Not with resentment toward Jade, with the specific discomfort of knowing that my achievements existed in contrast to my sister's, and that this contrast was felt by everyone in the room, even when no one said it directly. My mother said, "Zoe, I need to tell you something." I said, "Tell me." She said, "Jade asked me about your records about 2 years ago. She wanted to know if you had copies of everything or if the originals were somewhere she could access. I told her your diploma was in your apartment." I said, "Mom, Did you know what she was planning? A long silence. My mother said, I thought she was applying to a certification program. I thought she wanted to see what level she needed to reach. I didn't ask enough questions. I said, Mom. My mother said, I know, I should have asked. I looked at the LinkedIn profile still open on my laptop. Dr. Patricia Moore, Professor James Holloway, my GPA, my honors, my degree from my university under my sister's name, on a profile that had gotten her a position at the company where I had applied and been waitlisted 2 years ago. I said, I need to call the company. My mother said, Zoe, please think about... I said, Mom, she used my credentials to get a job. I need to call the company. I called my attorney first. Then I called the company. Harmon Group's HR department put me through to a woman named Rebecca, who handled credential verification for their professional staff. I said, My name is Zoe Williams. I am calling because I have reason to believe that an employee at your firm submitted academic credentials that belong to me rather than to her. Rebecca said, Can you give me the employee's name? I gave her Jade's name. Rebecca said, I need to verify your identity before I can discuss any employee's file. Can you provide your full name, date of birth, and the institution from which you claim the credentials were issued? I provided all three. Rebecca said, Please hold. She was gone for 4 minutes. When she came back, her voice had changed. The professional efficiency had been replaced by something more careful. Rebecca said, Ms. Williams, I have reviewed the application file for the employee you named. I need to ask you directly. Are you the Zoe Williams who graduated from the University of Georgia with a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration, GPA 3.9, in May of 4 years ago? I said, Yes. Rebecca said, Are Dr. Patricia Moore and Professor James Holloway people who would have written recommendation letters on your behalf? I said, Yes, both of them, for graduate school applications, not for employment applications for anyone else. A silence. Rebecca said, Ms. Williams, I need to involve our legal team in this conversation. Would you be available to speak with them today? I said yes. Rebecca said, I also want to inform you, and I am telling you this because I believe you have a right to know. The application file we have on record includes a copy of a diploma, a transcript, and 2 recommendation letters. The name on the diploma and transcript is Zoe Williams. The application was submitted under a different name. I said, I understand. Rebecca said, I'm very sorry. I said, thank you for telling me. I hung up. I sat in my apartment for a long time. Not crying. Building the folder. If you have ever had someone use the most specific and personal thing you earned as a tool for something you never agreed to, you already know why this story exists. Subscribe and hit the bell. New story every day. I called Jade the evening after my conversation with Harmon Group's legal team. I had spent the afternoon with my attorney, a woman named Michelle, who had handled a lease matter for me the previous year, going through the documentation of what had happened and what the options were. Michelle said, Zoe, what Jade did is credential fraud. Using someone else's academic credentials to obtain employment is a serious matter legally. The employer has the right to terminate her employment and to pursue civil and potentially criminal remedies. You have the right to pursue civil remedies for the use of your credentials without your consent. I said, what does she face? Michelle said, termination is certain. The civil exposure depends on demonstrable harm to you. The criminal exposure depends on whether the employer pursues it and whether the state prosecutor has appetite for a case involving family members. I said, I need to talk to her first. Michelle said, that's your choice. I advise you not to make any representations to her about what you will or will not do until you have a complete picture. I called Jade at 7 in the evening. She answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was the voice she used when she was managing something, warm, slightly careful, the voice that meant she had been expecting the call. I said, Jade, I saw your LinkedIn. Silence. I said, I called Harmon Group this afternoon. A longer silence. Jade said, Zoe. I said, I need you to listen before you explain anything. I need you to understand what I know before you decide what to say. She was quiet. I said, You have my diploma. You submitted my transcript under your application. You submitted recommendation letters written for me by my professors for your employment application. You have been working at a firm that hired you based on credentials that are mine. Jade said, I was going to tell you. I said, When? She said, When I had proven I could do the work, when it didn't matter anymore where the credentials came from. I sat with that. When it didn't matter anymore. The specific logic of someone who had decided that the end, a career, a position, proof of competence, justified the means that had been someone else's to own. I said, Jade, do you understand what you did? She said, I used your records, I know. I said, You used my records to get a job I applied for. My credentials, my professors, my GPA that I earned across 4 years of work that you watched me do, and you submitted them as yours to a company that called me promising because they thought I was you. She was very quiet. I said, Harmon Group is going to terminate your employment. Their legal team called me this afternoon. They are deciding whether to pursue further action. Jade said, What are you going to do? I looked at my diploma on the wall. The original. It had been returned by Rebecca, who had overnight mailed it to me the morning after our call with a formal letter documenting the circumstances of its submission. I said, I am going to tell you what I need, and then I am going to decide what I do next based on whether you give it to me. She said, What do you need? I said, 3 things. First, a complete account of every place you submitted my credentials, not just Harmon Group. Every application, every certification, every document where my records appeared under your name. I need to know the full scope. She said, Okay. I said, Second, you contact every institution or employer where my credentials were submitted, and you correct the record. In writing, with my attorney copied. She said, That will end my career in this field. I said, Jade, you built your career on my field, my credentials, my work. Silence. I said, Third, and this is the one that matters most to me, you do not do this to anyone else, ever. Whatever you decide to do with your career from here, you build it on what you actually have. She said, And if I do those things? I said, Then I tell Michelle to communicate to Harmon Group that I am not pursuing civil action and that I am not encouraging criminal referral. I said, I am not forgiving what you did. I am choosing not to destroy you for it. Those are different things. She said, I know. She said, I'm sorry, Zoe. I sat with the apology for a moment. It was real. I could hear it. Not the managed version she used when she needed something. The actual one. I said, I know you are. Start with the list. If this moment stayed with you, leave me a comment. Has someone ever used the most personal thing you earned, your education, your work, your reputation, without asking you? Tell me what happened. I read every single one. Jade provided the complete list 3 days later. 4 submissions over 2 years. Harmon Group. A certification program application. 2 freelance platform profiles where academic credentials were listed for credibility. She corrected all 4. Each correction was documented and sent to Michelle, who confirmed receipt and recorded it in the matter file. Harmon Group terminated her employment on the Friday after my initial call. Their legal team sent me a formal communication acknowledging the credential submission error and stating that they would not be pursuing further action given the circumstances and my communication through Michelle. The certification program she had applied to reviewed her file and withdrew her enrollment. She had not yet started the program. The freelance platform profiles were corrected. Her client relationships on those platforms were not affected. The work she had done there was her own work, regardless of how the credentials had been listed. This mattered to me. I had not wanted to destroy work she had actually done. The list had 4 items. She had given me all 4. I called Michelle after the last confirmation arrived. Michelle said, Zoe, You handled this with remarkable restraint." I said, "I handled it the way I needed to handle it." She said, "Yes, that's what I mean. I went to Sunday dinner 2 weeks after the last correction was confirmed. My mother had made the food she made when she needed everyone to sit down together. The table was set the same way it always was. Jade was there. We did not talk about any of it at dinner. We talked about other things, our cousin's new baby, a television show my father was watching, the garden my mother kept threatening to expand." After dinner in the kitchen, Jade and I were alone for a moment. She said, "I start a project management course next week, paid for myself." I said, "Good." She said, "The company is real. The work is real. I'm building it on what I actually have." I said, "I know." She looked at me. She said, "I should have done it this way from the beginning." I said, "Yes." I picked up the dish I was drying. I kept drying. That was enough. I am 29 years old, and my sister submitted my academic credentials under her name to obtain employment at a company where I had applied, and built 2 years of professional positioning on work I had done and records that were mine. The first thing, your credentials are yours, and they are specific to you. A GPA is not a general number. A Dean's List notation is not a generic honor. A recommendation letter from a professor who knew you across 4 years of academic work is not a transferable document. These things are specific records of your specific performance by specific people who knew you in a specific context. They cannot be borrowed. They can only be stolen. I want to say this clearly, not to make what Jade did sound more dramatic than it was, but because I think people sometimes underestimate how specific academic credentials are. They are not a generic qualification marker. They are the documented record of what you did and how specific people who observed you doing it chose to describe you. The employer who read my recommendation letters was reading what Dr. Moore and Professor Holloway had seen in me, in Zoe Williams, across 4 years of work. Those words were not transferable. They described a specific person in a specific context. Submitting them under a different name did not transfer what they described. It misrepresented it. The second thing is about what I chose not to do and why. I chose not to pursue civil action and not to encourage criminal referral. People will disagree with this choice. Some will say that consequences are necessary for deterrence. Some will say that Jade received far less consequence than the harm she caused warranted. They are not wrong. What I chose instead was the complete accounting. Every submission documented, every correction made, every record restored. I chose this because I needed to know the full scope, and because I needed the scope to be corrected rather than merely punished. The correction was what I needed, the proof that she understood what she had done and had gone back and fixed every instance of it. That was what mattered to me. Punishment for its own sake was not what I was after. I am not built for that. I am built for accuracy. The record was inaccurate. I needed it accurate. It is accurate now. The third thing is the most personal. Jade and I grew up in the same house. I watched her struggle with school in the ways she struggled, and she watched me succeed in the ways I succeeded, and neither of us asked for the dynamic that produced. The comparison, the contrast, the specific weight of a table where one person's achievements existed always in relation to another person's absence of them. I do not think what she did was about malice. I think it was about a person who watched someone else have a door and decided, in a moment of desperation or ambition or exhaustion at being on the wrong side of it, to use the key that was closest to hand. The key was mine. I do not forgive the using of it. I understand the reaching for it. Those are different things, and I am allowed to hold both. She is building something now on what she actually has. Project management course, real clients, real work. I hope it holds. Not for my sake, for hers. She is my sister. I want her to have something that is actually hers to stand on. The foundation has to be real, or the building falls. I know this. I built mine 1 semester at a time. Hi everyone, thank you for being here. Tell me in the comments, has someone ever used something you earned? your work, your reputation, your credentials, without asking because they thought you would not notice or would not act? And which moment stayed with you longer, reading Jade's LinkedIn, or her telling you she starts a course next week paid for herself? I read every single one. If this story reached you today, subscribe. New story every day. Zoe Williams, Atlanta, Georgia.